as Russian forces continue to advance all along the line of contact in Ukraine, we are seeing the current US administration attempt to continue the proxy war. And I will explain why I'm saying that, despite supposedly unprecedented breakthroughs, President Donald Trump calling Russian President Vladimir Putin, all of this discussion taking place, people taking sound bites that sound very promising, focusing on that, analyzing that. However, the actual substance of what is being said is identical to what was being said under the Biden administration. This is continuity of agenda, and I'm going to prove it to you right now. And I want to begin with the comments of current U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. This is the official U.S. Department of Defense, Secretary Hegseth's Department of Defense, February 13th, 2025. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, press conference following NATO Ministers of Defense meeting in Brussels, Belgium. And this is what he said. This is from this transcript. This is a transcript. And Secretary Hegseth says, one of the and so let's talk about the only thing that is actually changing, but not really, is that the administration itself is admitting the U.S. has real physical limits to what it can do in Ukraine. And if you listen carefully, you will understand that they have no actual problem in principle to continuing this war, this proxy war the U.S. started against Russia and is fighting against Russia through Ukraine. The problem is they physically cannot continue fighting this proxy war. They understand that they are going to lose if they do not freeze it. Ukraine's military will collapse. The Ukrainian military's fighting capacity will unravel, and Russia will take all of Ukraine. So if the United States and its European proxies do not do something about that first before it happens, and if it happens quickly enough, then Russia will win completely across all of Ukraine, and they will not allow that to happen. They would not allow it to happen under the Biden administration, and they are telling you now under the Trump administration they will not allow it to happen. So let's listen to Secretary Hegseth. One of the self-evident conclusions of the war in Ukraine was the underinvestment that both the European continent and America has had, unfortunately, in the defense industrial base. The ability to produce munitions, emerging technologies rapidly and field them was a blind spot exposed through the aggression against Ukraine. So hear him repeating the same language the Biden administration used to characterize this conflict in Ukraine. It wasn't because of NATO encroachment and its intention to encircle and contain Russia and eventually absorb Russia itself and Russia's reaction to that. This is all being blamed on Russia, Russian aggression. Ukraine has responded to that, as we've had a chance to listen to a great deal. Europe is responding to that, and so is America. We have to do more to ensure, whether you call it an arsenal of democracy or defending the free world, if America can't build and export and build and provide rapid capabilities because we're too stale or static or bureaucratic, or the Pentagon is bloated, then we're not able to field the systems we need in the future. The future to do what? To fight proxy wars exactly like this. So deep and dramatic reforms are coming at the Defense Department with the leadership of President Trump to ensure that we're investing robustly in our defense industrial base. Now, the U.S. defense industrial base, the U.S. military, as a fighting organization, is more than capable to protect the continental United States and even America's legitimate interests abroad, such as a Navy capable of protecting U.S. maritime shipping. The U.S. can very easily do that with its existing military. What they cannot do is fight a long, protracted, sustained, intense proxy war like what is taking place in Ukraine against a nation like Russia or a nation like China and actually win. That is what they cannot do. And so that is what they're trying to remedy. And he's telling you this right now in his own words. That is what he is saying. A great example is shipbuilding. So now this is specifically aimed at China because China is outpacing the United States and the US shipbuilding industry, the think tanks that are funded by the arms industry, they admit that it's impossible for them to catch up to China. There's literally nothing they can do to balance the playing field. They have fallen behind, and they will continue to fall behind, but they will not accept that. They will continue trying to find some way to gain the advantage and to reassert dominance, because that's what it has always been about. So he says, for a great example is shipbuilding. We need to vastly increase our ability to build ships and submarines, not just for ourselves, but to honor our obligations to our allies as well. And we will do that. Never explains how. Nobody has explained how that is possible. Foreign military sales is another thing I mentioned this morning with the Secretary General. We have for a long time been the country by with and through that our allies were able to supply major platforms and weapon systems like the F-35 and the Patriots and others. Whatever the system is, we need to reform that process so it's quicker, so a request today isn't delivered 7 years from now, but 3 years from now, with less red tape and with more efficient and effective technology possible. So no reflection on US foreign policy, how flawed it is, how unsustainable it is, and no real reflection as to the real problems that are preventing the US from matching Russia or China in terms of military-industrial output. He's simply saying it needs to be remedied. They're not talking about remedying it, and the only way it is actually remedied, and that is putting purpose over profit. They will never do that, so they will never succeed in this endeavor. And people will hear me say that and say, well, then what is the big deal? Why are we so worried about what the US is doing? Because the US still has a tremendous capacity to destabilize and even destroy entire regions of the planet as it kicks and screams, as its empire evaporates. So then he says, we hear from our allies, and that's part of being a good faith partner, is we're going to invest in our defense industrial base. We're going to make sure foreign military sales are as rapid as possible, which again is a force multiplier for American power, which is something we want to do in a contested world. The contested world, he's referring to the unipolar world order created by and for the United States versus multipolarism, a balance of power among nations, and America's necessity to find a place within that rather than imposing itself upon it. So he's talking about committing and reasserting the unipolar world order created by and for the United States. And he's talking about force multipliers for the United States. So he's talking about using Europe, using Japan, using South Korea to make up for the fact that it in and of itself, militarily, industrially, economically, it is incapable of matching Russia or China, let alone both. And I just want to refresh people's memories. During the Biden administration, DoD released its first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy, January 2024. And I did entire videos and articles about this. And what did they talk about inside that strategy document? They talked about using Europe, Japan, South Korea to make up for the shortcomings in their own industrial base. And so this was something rolled out by the Biden administration, the Department of Defense of Secretary Lloyd Austin, and now it is being continued without missing a beat by Secretary Hegseth. Let's continue with this solution. The solution now not necessarily to America's shortcomings in military-industrial output, but the conflict in Ukraine specifically. And this comes from this other U.S. Department of Defense readout. Hegseth calls on NATO allies to lead Europe's security, rules out support for Ukraine membership. So no NATO membership for Ukraine. At least that's what Secretary Hegseth and President Trump are saying now. But we have to remember the entire conflict taking place in Ukraine right now is because originally after the Cold War and Ukraine obtaining independence from the Soviet Union, The whole deal was that Ukraine would never join NATO. And when the conditions suited the United States to renege on that agreement, they did. And that is what has led us to this very conflict right now. And the only reason they're talking about not allowing Ukraine into NATO, at least for now, is because they need to buy time, because the conflict as it is right now is going to end in Russia's favor. They need to freeze the conflict, and that is exactly what Secretary Hegseth lays out. So let's listen to what he says here. The U.S. is committed to building a stronger, more lethal NATO. However, we must ensure that European and Canadian commitment to Article 3 of this treaty is just as strong. Article 3 says that allies, and I quote, by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. Leaders of our European allies should take primary responsibility for defense of the continent, which means security ownership by all allies, guided by a clear understanding of strategic realities. And it's an imperative given the strategic realities that we face. And that begins with increasing defense spending. 2% is a start, as President Trump has said, but it's not enough. Nor is 3%, nor is 4%. More like 5%. Real investment, real urgency. Again, NATO's existence, the purpose of NATO, which is to contain and eventually absorb Russia, is at the root of the conflict in Ukraine. NATO continuously expanded eastward towards Russia's borders. It started absorbing nations all along Russia's borders, including Ukraine. And this is what Russia is reacting to. The Trump administration is not acknowledging this, just as the Biden administration refused to acknowledge this reality. And instead of recognizing NATO as a threat and reconsidering the security architecture of all of Eurasia, which is all Russia has been asking for, they're going to ask each member state of NATO to more than double their financial commitment to the organization as part of expanding their individual and collective military industrial output. So please keep that in mind. They are talking about expanding NATO in terms of spending and expanding NATO and each member state's military industrial capacity, which is going to take time. Keep that in mind. We can talk all we want about values. Values are important, but you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags, and you can't shoot strong speeches. There is no replacement for hard power. As much as we may not want to like the world we live in some cases, there's nothing like hard power. It should be obvious that increasing allied European defense spending is critical, as the President of the United States has said. Also critical is expanding our defense industrial base capacity on both sides of the Atlantic. So there, he said it again. Our dollars, our euros, our pounds must become real capabilities. The U.S. is fully committed under President Trump's leadership to pursue these objectives in face of today's threats. What threats? What are the threats the U.S. actually faces? Is it Russia not wanting to be encroached upon by NATO, having nations along its border violently overthrown by U.S.-backed subversion and then absorbed into NATO, with the NATO organization aimed at eventually absorbing Russia next? Is that the threat? What about China? Is China a threat? Is it a threat because it refuses to allow the U.S. to undermine the sovereignty it has over Taiwan under international law, even under bilateral agreements with the U.S. itself? Now, this was the U.S. State Department's U.S. Relations with Taiwan webpage as of 2022, and this is what it said up to 2024. And it talks about the one China policy, and it explicitly says we do not support Taiwan independence. Now, under the U.S. State Department of Marco Rubio, they have completely erased that sentence, because that's what this is all about. This is about encroaching upon and absorbing Russia and China. And these nations are reacting to this, and then the U.S. presents these reactions as aggression from these nations. It went on all during the Biden administration, the previous Trump administration, 8 years of Obama, Bush Jr., so on and so forth, and it is now continuing very deliberately under the Trump administration. This removal of "we do not recognize Taiwan independence" is very deliberate, and it is meant to provoke China. So this is the threat U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is talking about, a threat of America's own creation because of its own aggression abroad, its own encroachment upon these nations, and these nations refusing to accept it. And they have every right to resist being encroached upon and their very sovereignty usurped out from under them. What about the actual conflict itself? So they obviously need time to raise funding for NATO, for that funding to actually manifest itself into the hard power Secretary Hegseth is so obsessed with, and the expansion of the military-industrial base. This is going to take years. So what is the solution for this conflict in Ukraine? If Russia is winning right now on the battlefield, and the collapse of Ukraine's military can happen at any time, nobody knows when it will collapse, how long it can hold out. What are they going to do to buy time to expand military-industrial production so that they can continue waging this proxy war with the advantage in their favor? So this is what he says, again, under this statement here. Again, the links to all of this will be in the video description below. This is what he says. "We are at a critical moment. As the war approaches its 3rd anniversary, our message is clear. The bloodshed must stop and the war must end," Hegseth told the group. Fair enough. Everybody hears that and they say that is a positive statement. They can agree with that. As an alternative to granting Ukraine NATO membership, Hegseth said that any security guarantees for Ukraine must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, Hegseth said, adding that they must also be robust oversight of the line of contact from the international community. So elsewhere, he's talking about an enduring peace, but here he's talking about the line of contact and Western troops occupying what's left of Ukraine and essentially freezing the conflict in Ukraine exactly as the US froze the conflict in Syria. The proxy war in Syria was being lost. The US occupied eastern Syria, Turkey occupied northern Syria, and they just held on and they undermined Syria. They overstretched Russia elsewhere until the opportunity presented itself for them to finally finish the conflict, overthrow the Syrian government, and now their proxies control all of Syria. This is what they are doing again in Ukraine. This is the plan that they are laying out for all to see, for anyone who wants to open their eyes and their ears to see and hear it. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will be no U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine, he said. And again, this is not because the U.S. doesn't want to be involved. They cannot be involved. If they get dragged into intervention in Ukraine, they will be unable to address China in the Indo-Pacific region. This conflict that the State Department is already teeing up by changing their own official stance on Taiwan, betraying the one China policy they agreed with Beijing over. They cannot have their troops tied up in Ukraine. They need their troops and their equipment, their Patriot missiles, their long-range missiles. They need all of that for the Indo-Pacific. They cannot afford to have it tied up in Ukraine, protecting U.S. troops stationed there. So they're going to use their European proxies. This was always a proxy war, not just through Ukraine, but through all of Europe. Europe has been made to pay the price for this conflict all along. The very first thing the U.S. wanted to do, even before the conflict began, before the special military operation began, under the Trump and then Biden administration, they were pressuring Germany to cut the Nord Stream pipeline off from Russia, to stop importing hydrocarbons from Russia, to isolate and pressure Russia. And then when the conflict began, the pressure became overwhelming. They literally blew up the pipeline. And even now, under the Trump administration, they're talking about sanctions. They're talking about
to further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine. President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table.
Ever since this conflict began, I had warned about the collective West never allowing Ukraine to fully fall to Russia, the fact that they would intervene directly and create a buffer zone, just as they did in Syria. And this was what was being prepared all throughout the Biden administration. And now this is what Secretary Hegseth and President Trump, quite frankly, are talking about and preparing to do now. It is, again, continuity of agenda. Absolutely nothing has changed. The rhetoric, maybe slightly, some of the theatrics, calling President Putin on the phone, but the very core aspects of U.S. policy toward Ukraine, toward Russia, toward China for that matter, have not changed. It is continuing uninterrupted through this now Trump administration. This, in regards to Ukraine specifically, is just Minsk 3. We remember Minsk 1 and 2. European leaders admitted that this was just a way of buying time, because at that time, Ukraine's military was weak and it was facing collapse. And so they wanted to buy time. They feigned interest in freezing the conflict, arriving at some sort of peace, but all they did was just buy time so they could rearm Ukraine and start the conflict anew. And that is exactly what they did. And that is what they are doing now. And you have been warned. And if you listen to Secretary Hegseth, President Trump, Secretary Rubio, if you listen to them carefully, that is exactly what they are telling you they're going to do. One last very interesting thing Secretary Hegseth said was this bit about the division of labor. A lot of people interpret the U.S. dumping the Ukraine conflict onto Europe because it's not interested in it anymore. And I'm telling you, that's not the reason why they're doing it. They physically cannot invest anymore in Ukraine and also invest in their containment strategy toward China. They're trying to provoke, and then they hope to win a war against China. They cannot do that if they're still tied up with Ukraine. So he says something very interesting about the division of labor. Let's listen.
The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Deterrence cannot fail for all of our sakes. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. In my first weeks as Secretary of Defense, under President Trump's leadership, we've seen promising signs that Europe sees this threat, understands what needs to be done, and is stepping up to the task. For example, Sweden recently announced its largest ever assistance package. We applaud them for committing $1.2 billion in ammunition and other needed material. Poland is spending 5% of GDP on defense already, which is a model for the continent. And 14 other countries are co-leading capability coalitions. These groups are doing great work to coordinate Europe's contributions of legal assistance across 8 key capability areas. These are first steps. More must still be done. We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made. And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals.
If you listen to Secretary Hegseth speak, it's very obvious he has no interest in ending the conflict in Ukraine. He is imploring Europe to expand their efforts to keep the war going. The United States is not withdrawing from the conflict because it's no longer interested. It's just simply no longer capable of investing as much in Ukraine with the conflict that is now starting to expand and escalate with in Asia Pacific with China. He talks about the need to deter war with China. Well, what is he actually talking about? He's talking about America's decades of encroaching upon, violating the sovereignty of, antagonizing and provoking China. And what they are worried about is China reaching a military and economic level where it is able to push back. And that is what they're trying to deter. They're trying to deter China from asserting itself against American antagonism. The U.S. has never even talked about a real threat China poses to the actual United States. They're talking about the threat China poses to their own forces antagonizing China closer to Chinese shores than to American shores. So what is Secretary Hegseth, what is the Trump administration actually saying in regards to Ukraine and its overall approach to foreign policy and its defense policy? It is not dismantling American interference overseas. It is not dismantling the pursuit of American hegemony worldwide. It is simply reorganizing it, even outsourcing it. That is basically what he's saying in regards to Europe. Europe will take care of America's interests vis-a-vis Russia. We need to commit all of our resources to China. There's simply not enough to go around. If there was, we would remain committed in Europe as well. So let's hear what they are actually saying, not what we just wish they were saying. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. In the video description below will be all of the links that I reference. Read the transcripts for yourself. In one of these Department of Defense releases, they have a full video of Secretary Hegseth's opening statement. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not benefiting me at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.